I sold my late mother's house for $340,000. I drove straight to my husband's law firm to tell him we were finally free from debt. When I pushed open his office door, I heard his voice, soft, intimate, unmistakably tender, speaking to someone who was not me. My name is Dorothy Callahan, and I am 63 years old. If anyone had asked me last spring what my life looked like, I would have said it was quiet, modest, the kind of life that doesn't make headlines. My husband, Gerald, was a partner at a mid-sized family law firm in Mississauga, Ontario. We had been married for 31 years. Our children were grown. Our son Marcus lived in Vancouver. Our daughter Simone had just finished her master's degree at the University of Waterloo. Gerald and I were, by every outward measure, a normal couple entering the peaceful years people call the golden age of marriage. We had carried debt for most of those 31 years. Gerald's student loans from Osgoode Hall, the second mortgage we took when the firm went through a rough patch in 2008, the line of credit we opened when Simone's tuition spiked. I had worked as an administrative coordinator at a Peel Region Community Health Center for 26 years, cutting coupons, cooking from scratch, driving a 12-year-old Civic that rattled on the highway. Every dollar I saved went into keeping us afloat. Gerald always said, "Dorothy, you are the anchor of this family." I believed him. I was proud of it. My mother passed in February, quietly, the way she had always lived. She left me her house in Burlington, a small 2-story semi-detached she had owned outright since 1987. The house was not glamorous, but the Burlington real estate market had transformed it into something substantial. The estate lawyer told me over the phone that after legal fees and land transfer, I would net just over $340,000. I sat in my car in the health center parking lot and cried for 20 minutes, not just from grief, from relief. That money would pay off every debt we carried, the line of credit, the remaining mortgage balance, Gerald's professional corporation loan. We would be free, truly free, for the first time in our marriage. I imagined his face. I imagined us booking that trip to Prince Edward Island we had been deferring for 15 years. I drove directly to his office. The firm was in a converted Victorian on Ontario Street. I knew the receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who smiled when I walked in. "Mrs. Callahan, this is a nice surprise. Is Gerald expecting you?" I shook my head and smiled back. "I want to surprise him. Big news." She started to reach for the phone and I waved her off gently. "Don't bother him. I'll just pop my head in." She hesitated the way people do when something is slightly wrong but they cannot name it. I walked down the hallway toward the corner office Gerald had occupied for 11 years. The door was not fully closed. I was about to knock when I heard his voice through the gap, and it stopped me cold. It was a voice I had not heard him use in years. Low, warm, stripped of the professional distance he wore like a second suit. I heard him say, "Once everything is settled with Dorothy, we won't have to hide anymore. I'm tired of pretending." I did not move. My hand was raised to knock and I could not lower it. I heard a woman's voice, younger, careful, say, "Are you sure the timing is right?" And Gerald said, "She has no idea. She never has. She's too trusting for her own good. Too trusting for her own good. Too trusting for her own good." I lowered my hand. I backed away from the door slowly, the way you back away from the edge of something very high. My chest felt like the inside of a car in January, frozen and airless. I walked back down the hallway. I smiled at Priya and said I had forgotten I had a meeting. I told her, "Please, don't mention I was here. I want to reschedule the surprise." She looked at me with an expression I would think about later, not surprise, but something sadder. The expression of someone who already knew. I sat in my Civic in the parking lot for a long time. The $340,000 felt different now. It felt like a weapon someone had handed me without knowing what I would do with it. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table in our house in Streetsville, and I looked at the walls I had painted myself in 2019, at the curtains I had sewn, at the photographs on the shelf above the television. 31 years arranged on a shelf. I did not cry. I had already cried enough for one day, and it had been for the wrong reason. I thought very carefully. Gerald was a family lawyer. He knew every mechanism of matrimonial property division in Ontario. He knew the Family Law Act the way I knew the layout of my own kitchen. He would know exactly how to position himself before asking for a divorce. He would know which assets to move, which accounts to thin, which timing gave him the greatest advantage. He had probably already begun. Too trusting for her own good. He had been counting on that. The $340,000 from my mother's estate was considered an inheritance under Ontario's Family Law Act. Inherited property is excluded from equalization of net family property, but only if I kept it separate from family finances, only if I did not mix it into joint accounts. If I deposited it into our joint account, Gerald could claim equalization rights to half. If I kept it separate and could prove it was a direct inheritance, it was mine alone. I had not yet received the funds. The estate had not yet closed. I had perhaps 3 weeks before the transfer would arrive. I needed to move carefully. The first person I called was my sister Margaret, who lives in Hamilton. Not because she is the most practical person I know, she is not, but because she is the most discreet. Margaret had never liked Gerald. She had told me this exactly once, 14 years ago, and never raised it again, which is how I knew she meant it. When I told her what I had heard, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dorothy, what do you need me to do?" I told her I needed her to open a new account at a credit union that Gerald had no connection to. I needed the inheritance deposited there. Not in my name at TD, where Gerald was also a client and where we had joint accounts for 30 years. Margaret had banked at Meridian Credit Union since the 90s. She knew the branch manager. She drove to Hamilton the next morning. I also needed to understand exactly what Gerald had been doing. He was a lawyer, which meant he was careful, but careful people still leave traces when they have been at something for long enough and believe the person watching them is too trusting to look. I started looking. I did not go through his phone. That is the first thing people think of, and it is also the first thing a careful person protects. I went through the household filing cabinet, which Gerald had long since stopped paying any attention to because I was the one who managed the paper. I found his professional corporation's annual financial statements, which he had filed as PDF printouts going back 4 years. I am not an accountant, but 26 years in health center administration taught me to read a budget line. The corporation's declared income had dropped significantly in the last 2 years. The drawings Gerald took as salary had decreased, but our lifestyle had not decreased. We still went to Tremblant at Christmas. He had bought a new suit in March. He had paid cash for a weekend I now understood was not a work conference in Ottawa. The money was going somewhere before it reached the corporation's declared income. I did not know enough to know exactly where, but I knew someone who might. Her name was Renata. She had worked as a bookkeeper at Gerald's firm for 9 years before he let her go 18 months ago. He told me she had been inefficient, that the firm was restructuring. I had sent her a card. We were not close, but we had chatted at every firm Christmas party for nearly a decade. I found her on LinkedIn. She was now working independently as a bookkeeper for small businesses in the Peel region. I sent her a message. I told her I would like to meet for coffee if she had time, that it was personal, not firm-related. She replied within 2 hours. We met at a Tim Hortons on Dundentis Street in Oakville. She arrived before me, and she did not seem surprised to see me. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things. Then I looked at her directly and said, "Renata, I know something is wrong with Gerald's finances. I don't know the details. I'm asking because I need to protect myself and I don't have much time." She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the table. She said, "I signed a non-disclosure agreement when I left." I told her I understood and I was not asking her to break it. I told her I was not looking for ammunition. I was looking for a direction, somewhere to point a proper accountant. She looked up at me. She said, "I didn't leave because of inefficiency. I left because he asked me to book expenses through a numbered company in a way that I wasn't comfortable with. When I said I wasn't comfortable, he let me go." She slid a paper napkin across the table. On it, she had written a series of numbers. A federal business registration number, the numbered company. She folded her hands around her coffee again and looked out the window. "I was there for 9 years, she said. "You were always kind to me at those parties. That's all I'm going to say." I thanked her. I picked up the napkin and put it in my coat pocket. I paid for both coffees. That night I searched the numbered company through the Canada Revenue Agency's business registry. The corporation was registered to a numbered holding company with a registered agent. I could not get further without a professional. I used some of the money from my personal savings, not Gerald's money, my own, to retain a forensic accountant named Paul who worked with a firm in downtown Toronto. I explained the situation. I gave him the registration number, the financial statements from the filing cabinet, and my timeline. He told me he would be in touch within 10 days. I went home. I cooked dinner. Gerald came home at 7:15. He kissed me on the cheek and told me about a client file that was frustrating him. I handed him a plate and asked about his day. I listened to him speak, and I thought, you have no idea who you are talking to right now. In the weeks that followed, I maintained the performance with a discipline that surprised me. I continued driving to work each morning. I continued paying the bills I always paid. I did not change anything visible. At night, after Gerald fell asleep, I stayed at the kitchen table with a notepad, and I built my picture piece by piece. Paul, the forensic accountant, came back to me in 9 days. He asked for a meeting in person. I met him at his Bay Street office on a Thursday morning and told Gerald I had a dental appointment. Paul sat across from me with a printed report and a very careful expression. He told me that the numbered company appeared to have received a significant flow of fee income that should have been recorded through the professional corporation. Over 3 years, the amount redirected was substantial. He estimated between $80,000 and $110,000 had been moved outside the corporation's declared income before Gerald's personal drawings were calculated. This reduced his declared equalization value significantly and also represented potential unreported income to the CRA. Paul told me he could not be 100% certain without access to the firm's internal accounts, but based on the corporate filings available and the financial statements I had provided, the pattern was clear and consistent. I asked him if he could prepare a written summary. He said he could. I asked him what I should do with it. He said, "With respect, Mrs. Callahan, that is a question for a family lawyer." I hired one the next day. Not in Mississauga. I hired a woman in Toronto named Ms. Okonkwo, who had been practicing family law for 22 years and who came recommended by a colleague at the health center. I told Ms. Okonkwo everything. She listened without interrupting, which in my experience means someone is actually absorbing what you are saying rather than preparing their response. When I finished, she said, "You have done more preparation than most clients who come to me after 2 years of litigation." Then she told me exactly what my rights were. Under the Ontario Family Law Act, my inheritance, kept separate, documented as a direct estate transfer, not commingled with family property, was excluded from equalization. The $340,000 was mine. If Gerald attempted to claim otherwise, the paper trail from the estate lawyer, the Meridian account in Margaret's name, and the transfer documentation would protect it. The numbered company income was a separate matter. If Gerald had underreported family income during the marriage to reduce his equalization obligation, that was the kind of thing a court looked at very carefully. Paul's report, combined with any disclosure Gerald would be required to make in family court, could be significant. I asked Ms. Okonkwo when I should move. She said, "Not yet." She asked me to do one more thing. She asked me to document what I could about lifestyle spending. Vacations, purchases, restaurant charges that did not correspond to the income Gerald declared. I had 3 months of credit card statements already in the filing cabinet. I spent a weekend making copies. I couriered them to Ms. Okonkwo's office on a Tuesday. The inheritance funds arrived in Margaret's account on a Wednesday afternoon in May. I remember sitting in my car in the health center parking lot when Margaret texted me. $341,000 and some change, she wrote. Safe and sound. I sat there for a moment with my phone in my hands and thought of my mother. Her small kitchen in Burlington, the way she hung her dish towels on the oven handle in pairs. She had worked her whole life to own that house. Now it was going to give her daughter a way out. I texted Margaret back, "Thank you." Gerald asked for a meeting 3 weeks later. He asked me on a Sunday morning over coffee in a tone that told me he had been rehearsing it. He said things had not been right between us for some time. He said he had been doing some soul-searching. He said he had grown in a direction he hadn't anticipated, and he felt it was only fair to be honest with me now rather than continue pretending everything was fine. He had met someone, he said. He cared about her. He was sorry. He hoped we could handle this like two adults who had shared a long life and still respected each other. He slid a folder across the kitchen table. Inside was a draft separation agreement. It had already been reviewed by someone. I could see the margin notes, but he presented it as a starting point, a conversation. His declared net family property was listed. It was significantly lower than I would have expected after 31 years of his income. The inheritance was noted as a potential claim. He had included a line suggesting the estate funds, if received during the marriage, might be subject to equalization review. That was the maneuver. He was going to try to reach into my mother's house. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I thought of Priya's expression in the hallway, and Renata with her hands around her coffee cup and my mother's dish towels. I said, "I appreciate your honesty, Gerald. I'll have my lawyer review this." He looked slightly surprised. He had expected tears, perhaps. Or anger. I think he had expected the Dorothy he had described to someone through a not-quite-closed office door. Too trusting for her own good. I called Ms. Okonkwo that afternoon. The next 4 months moved in a way I had not anticipated, not slowly, as divorce proceedings often do, but with increasing momentum, like a wheel finding a slope. Gerald's lawyer filed the separation agreement formally. Ms. Okonkwo filed a response. She challenged Gerald's declared net family property and requested full financial disclosure, which is standard in Ontario Family Court, but which Gerald, knowing the terrain, had clearly hoped to avoid with a quick negotiated settlement. When disclosure was ordered, Paul's forensic report became the frame through which every number was examined. Gerald's team tried to argue the numbered company income was legitimate corporate restructuring. The CRA, which had been separately notified, Ms. Okonkwo had made sure of that, with my signed consent, was running its own process. The two things together created a pressure that no amount of legal maneuvering could fully absorb. His lawyer, I was told through the channel of formal correspondence, became less aggressive in tone as the months progressed. There was a mediation session in September in a boardroom in a downtown Toronto office tower, 42 floors up, with a view of the lake on a clear autumn morning. Gerald sat across from me for the first time since I had left that kitchen table in June. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking. Not physically. Gerald had always been a large man, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a room. But something had contracted in him. He looked like someone who had made a series of reasonable-sounding decisions that had led him somewhere he had not imagined. Miss Okonkwo sat beside me. She had told me before we entered the room, "Let me talk. You are here to make decisions, not arguments." I followed that instruction completely. The settlement we reached was not the one in Gerald's original folder. My inheritance was confirmed as excluded property, fully mine, untouchable. Gerald's actual net family property, once the undeclared corporate income was factored into the equalization calculation, was substantially higher than his initial declaration. I received an equalization payment. I retained my pension from the health center. I kept the car and a share of the household contents. Gerald's professional reputation in the context of the CRA review and the court record of his undisclosed income was not something money could simply repair. I did not feel triumphant walking out of that boardroom. I want to be honest about that. 31 years is not a small thing to set down. I had loved Gerald, or I had loved the version of him I believed existed, and those two things are not easily separated even when you know the truth. I stood in the elevator with Ms. Okonkwo, and I looked at my own reflection in the brushed steel door, and I thought, this is the first day of a life that belongs entirely to you. I moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Burlington that October, 3 blocks from where my mother's house had stood before the new owners took possession. I chose Burlington deliberately. It is where I was raised. It is where I know the streets, and the lake, and the particular quality of the light in the morning. I bought the condo outright with a portion of the inheritance and the equalization payment. I own it. My name is on the title and no one else's. Marcus flew in from Vancouver for Christmas. Simone drove up from Waterloo. We had dinner at my table. A table that I had chosen, in a kitchen that I had organized exactly the way I wanted it, with my mother's dish towels hanging on the oven handle in pairs, because I had kept 2 of them, and I hang them that way now, every day. My children already knew. I had told them plainly, without excessive detail, when the separation was confirmed. Marcus was angry in the way sons can be, protectively and almost physically. Simone was quiet for a long time and then said, "Mom, I always thought you held that marriage together by yourself. I'm sorry it took this long for you to be free of it." I told her that I was not sure I agreed with the framing, that marriage is never held together by one person alone. that I had made choices too, and not all of them had been wise. But I said it without apology, which is the difference between understanding your past and being imprisoned by it. Renata sent me a card in November. She had heard through some professional network that the matter had been resolved. She wrote only 3 lines. She said she was glad I had taken care of myself. She said she had thought about our coffee meeting many times. She said she hoped I was well. I wrote back and told her I was. I meant it. The woman, I never learned her name and I did not try, apparently ended things with Gerald sometime during the autumn. I heard this from someone who heard it from someone else, which is the way these things travel. I do not think about her much. She was not the cause of what happened. The cause was much older and quieter than she was. I retired from the health center in March, 6 months ahead of what I had planned, because I could afford to, and because I had spent 26 years being useful to other people's systems, and I wanted to spend some time being useful to my own life. I am learning to watercolor. I take a Tuesday morning class at the Burlington Art Center. I am not skilled yet, but I am patient, and my instructor says patience is the larger part of the work. Last month, I stood on the shore of Lake Ontario, just south of Lakeshore Road on a gray Tuesday afternoon, watching the water. It was cold the way late autumn in Ontario is cold, without drama, just a bone-level insistence. I had my coat and my gloves and a travel mug of tea. I had nowhere I needed to be for the rest of the day, which is a sensation I am still learning to inhabit without guilt. I thought about my mother, who had worked her whole life and saved her whole life, and in the end left me the only thing she had to give. I thought about the way luck and timing and a door left slightly open can change everything. I thought about the version of Dorothy who had stood in a parking lot in Mississauga with her hand raised to knock and heard something that broke her life into a before and an after. She had walked away quietly. She had not made a scene. She had not handed her weapon to someone who would use it against her. She had taken a breath, and then another, and then she had gone home and made tea and started thinking. That woman deserved every good thing that came to her. I finished my tea and walked back to my car. The lake was still there behind me, wide and gray and entirely indifferent, the way large things are. I drove home along the lakeshore, past the street where my mother's house used to be, past the Tim Hortons where I had sat across from Renata and accepted a paper napkin with a number on it, past every ordinary landmark of a life that had now, finally, become wholly and unambiguously mine. If you're listening to this and something in it sounds familiar, if you have ever been in a hallway with your hand raised to knock and heard something you were not supposed to hear, I want you to know one thing. Your silence is not weakness. Your patience is not passivity. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away quietly. Go home, make tea, and start thinking. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the comments. There is something I have been thinking about since this whole chapter of my life finally closed. I've been thinking about how much of what happened to me was not caused by bad luck, and not caused by fate, but caused by choices. His choices? Yes, but also mine. Not in the way that assigns blame to the person who was deceived. I want to be clear about that. What Gerald did was his doing entirely, but the way I responded to it, that was mine, and it mattered enormously. When I stood in that hallway on her Ontario Street and heard my husband describe me as too trusting for my own good, I could have done a great many things. I could have pushed open that door. I could have driven home and dissolved. I could have called Marcus and handed the whole terrible mess to someone else to carry. I did none of those things. I walked away, and I started thinking, and I think that decision, quiet and unglamorous as it was, changed everything that followed. What I have come to understand is that when someone underestimates you, they are handing you something. Gerald spent 31 years assuming that because I managed the household and kept things running smoothly and never demanded explanations for the financial decisions he made, I was incapable of understanding them. He mistook my patience for ignorance. He mistook my steadiness for passivity. He built his plan on the foundation of what he believed I was, and what he believed I was turned out to be entirely wrong. That is a lesson I want to sit with carefully, because it works in both directions. The same quality that made me vulnerable, the willingness to trust without verifying, to support without questioning, was also, when I finally directed it inward, the quality that protected me. I trusted Margaret completely, and she was exactly as reliable as I knew her to be. I trusted Renata's conscience, and she met me at that table and slid a napkin across it without being asked to. I trusted Miss Auchincloh's competence, and she delivered every single thing she said she would. The capacity for trust is not a flaw. Misplaced trust is a flaw, and those two things are not the same. Dorothy kept her head when everything she had believed in for 3 decades turned out to be something else. She gathered information before she spoke. She protected what was hers before she revealed what she knew. She did not let grief make her reckless, and she did not let anger make her hasty. That restraint was not weakness. It was the most powerful thing she did. Every good outcome that followed, the inheritance protected, the settlement fair, the freedom real, grew directly from those early quiet weeks of clear-headed work. I think about that sometimes when I am at the lake or at my Tuesday morning watercolor class, fumbling with a brush and trying to learn something new at 63. The life I have now did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a consequence. I made choices that were careful and disciplined and sometimes very hard, and those choices produce results that matched them. That is not a guarantee that life always rewards decency. I am old enough to know better than to promise that, but I do know that when you bring your full intelligence and your full courage to a situation, you give yourself the best possible chance. And sometimes that is enough. Take good care of yourselves.